Welcome to the inaugural Betty Churcher Memorial Oration. I'm Nick Mitsevich, the Director of the National Gallery of Australia. I acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the Canberra region, known today as Canberra, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and all First Nations people across Australia. We recognise their continuing connection to country and culture and pay our respects to elders, leaders and artists past and present. The National Gallery is custodian of the world's largest collection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art, and one of our most significant works, Emily Kang Naware's Al-Halgara series, stands behind me. The Betty Churcher Memorial Oration is a new major event in the National Gallery's program. This event recognises and celebrates leading women of the arts who inspire creativity and inclusivity in their contributions to cultural life, both here in Australia and across the globe. The Betty Churcher Oration is one of several initiatives that supports the Gallery's ongoing commitment to gender equity and greater inclusivity for all. Last month, we released the Gallery's first Gender Equity Action Plan that follows the success of the Know My Name initiative to address historic bias and underrepresentation of women and gender diverse artists in the National Collection, and more broadly across the cultural sector. Tonight, we'll hear from one of the world's leading art authorities, the Australian expatriate and current director of the Smithsonian's Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C., Dr Melissa Chiu, interviewed by author and award-winning Australian journalist Julia Baird. We'll cross to Melissa and Julia shortly, but before then, I wanted to introduce Betty Churcher, particularly if you're not already familiar with her important contribution to art and cultural life in Australia. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Betty's family, who supported the establishment of this memorial oration in her honour. Betty Churcher was the National Gallery's second director and the first and only woman to hold this position. Betty also was the first woman to lead an Australian tertiary education centre as Dean of the School of Art and Design at Phillip Institute of Technology in Melbourne in 1982, and the first woman to lead a state gallery as Director of the Art Gallery of Western Australia in 1987. As Director of the National Gallery from 1990 to 1997, Betty oversaw an era of creative transformation and major audience growth. She was committed to removing as many barriers that may stand between the audience and a work of art. And she became known as Betty Blockbuster for her commitment to large-scale exhibitions that could break through to audiences beyond traditional gallery goers. It is the spirit of Betty's inclusive approach that continues in the gallery's current vision to lead a contemporary cultural agenda. Thank you, Melissa and Julia, for helping us launch the Betty Churcher Memorial Oration, and over to you.
Thank you, Nick, and what a great honour to be here in conversation with Dr Melissa Chiu, an Australian whose reputation and whose influence has spanned the globe as a curator and as a champion of contemporary art, and whose trajectory has seen her go from Darwin to Sydney to New York to now Washington. So what is it that drives her? And what is her vision? And why has it been so popular? Why has it struck a chord with so many audiences? These are the things we'll be talking about today. As we know, she's now director of the Smithsonian's Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. And since she arrived in 2014 there, she's maintained the focus on 20th and 21st century art, but also presented landmark exhibitions of work by some of today's most important artists, really worth noting and focusing on here, because they're notably Shirin Neshat, Yayoi Kusama, and Laurie Anderson. Under her leadership, the Hirshhorn has also commissioned site-specific artworks that respond to the museum's very unique and beautiful modern architecture, including Mark Bradford's longest ever painting, spanning 300 feet. And the public have lapped it up. Under her leadership, the Hirshhorn welcomed over 1 million visitors in 2017 alone, and this was its highest annual attendance in nearly 30 years, doubling its visitation from 3 years before, which is really an astonishing achievement, I think. She's also authored and edited several books. She wrote a PhD with a dissertation on contemporary Chinese art at the University of Western Sydney. And her books and catalogues in contemporary art have included Contemporary Art in Asia, A Critical Reader, and she's also lectured at a host of august institutions of higher education, including Harvard, Yale, and Columbia. And she's talking to us today. Now, Melissa, welcome. Lovely to have you today.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for that rather lengthy introduction.
I could go on, but I just kept it concise for you today.
Long.
Well, I really wanted to outline, just kind of in a nutshell, what your significance has been, particularly in the last few years. But before we get to the work that you've done, can you tell us, how did this happen with you? Like you grew up in Darwin. At what point were you drawn to art, and did you realise this would be your life?
Yes, it's always in some ways hard to think about beginnings. It was so long ago now, but yes, it's true that in Darwin, I did become interested in art. In fact, if I remember, it was one of my mother's friends who was an art teacher who first really got me interested in drawing and painting. But it was in high school when I had to make a decision about where I wanted to study that I became even more interested in working in museums. And it was at that moment when I discovered you could be a curator, someone who organizes exhibitions and works with artists, that I began my studies in art history. I often talk about familial background defining people, and that was also the case for me, in that, and my sister will blush at this, but I have a twin sister who was a straight A, perfect student. Just loved her. Teachers loved her so much, and I was kind of, to be honest, more of a maybe B student. And art for me was that place where I could do well. And so I, throughout school, I really enjoyed art more than anything else. And so it was that decision. And in Australia, the tertiary schooling system is a little bit different, because it requires that you make your big career decision still in high school. In the US, you're given a few more years of a kind of general degree in order to then specialize. So we all had to make this decision, and I decided to study art history and criticism with the idea of wanting to become a museum curator.
Can you remember like one particular piece of art that really excited you or captured your imagination when you were a kid or a teenager?
It was a work by Brett Whiteley at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. That wonderful self-portrait of him looking at himself in the mirror with the expanse of the Sydney Harbour behind him. And I still remember that work as really allowing me to think about the scale of art, that this was a grand gesture. And also to be thinking about the fact that I think I knew even then that I didn't necessarily want to become an artist, but I did want to work in museums. And so for me, it was like a process of even thinking about not the act of making art, but what was around the art. How was the museum creating a context for understanding that? So that kind of became more of my preoccupation as I went more often to museums and discovered a whole like contemporary art world in Sydney.
Because it's probably, as you've said, it's like such a particular and unique and actually rare position to be a curator. There are very few curators, in the world.
There were very few jobs.
Yeah, right.
Nobody told me that.
Well, you seem to have managed pretty well, irrespective of that. So tell us about how then you came to Sydney and then you went to New York.
So I was educated in Sydney for high school and my university degrees. And it was my family's decision to move to Sydney for high school and my sister's education. And then deciding on the degree that I would ultimately study was that important decision that a lot of teenagers have to make. And so I was fortunate to have studied at the University of Western Sydney. It was a fairly new degree at the time. And it really gave me the freedom to be able to both study art history, have a studio practice, which was very unusual at the time. So it made sure that you're fully engaged in the making of art, which has informed a lot of the work that I've done with artists in curation, meaning that I have something of an understanding of, firstly, how hard it is to make work that is individual and, will kind of reach visitors in different ways. It gives you a sense of, I think, modesty in some way, that you know how hard it is to make things. You also know the processes that artists go through in terms of the technical, application of paint or printmaking or other things. That really gave me a grounding in what I think ultimately I wanted to do.
Did you feel that being Australian gave you a particularly unique perspective? I know when I worked in New York for a few years as a news magazine editor, my editor used to say to me, it's like you're like an anthropologist. You've got more of a Margaret Mead kind of take on things, because I could see things a bit at a distance.
Yes.
What about you?
So when I first moved to New York, it was, I think it was about 2 weeks before 9/11. So my introduction to New York, I think, was a fairly unique one, of kind of a city, in recovery from a major tragic event. And I think I was surprised as an Australian at the sense of nationalism that came out of that moment. And the fact that I was working in the Asia Society, which was an American organization, but very Asia focused. And I think as an Australian, it gave me, in some ways, a somewhat different approach from both how most Americans are trained, but also an understanding of the world. I often think of Australia as a middle power, and it also played a very important role within the Asia-Pacific region. And I kind of came of age at the moment of APEC and many other developments. And so that really helped my work at the Asia Society, with the main goal of introducing Asian artists to American audiences. So it was a very different point of view, I think, being Australian in New York, and in a way with the goal of introducing Asian artists to American audiences. So in some ways it was an unusual position.
So what's that been like? What have been kind of some of the obstacles and opportunities of introducing Asian art to American audiences?
I think one of the real challenges, initially at least, was that there is a degree of unfamiliarity with Asia and Asian art. And so a lot of the work that I did was to try to select, in a way, the artists or art movements that could have possible relationships with American art history or American history. And so it's kind of trying to find those points of connection. And so that was in some ways the challenge of the work that I was doing for Asia study. And the opportunities were that when it hit the right chord or the right note within the US, there were moments of real impact that you could see how an exhibition could change people's minds, could educate them, could bring them closer to something that before perhaps even seemed very far away.
Can you give us an example of that?
So one example is an exhibition that I co-curated with an artist, Zhang Shangtian. It was the first exhibition of art from China's Cultural Revolution, the period of 1966 to 1976. There had never been an exhibition of this subject before, for a number of reasons. It was a very difficult period in China's history, often known as a Black period that people really didn't want to talk about. But it was in my research for my PhD on Chinese contemporary art that I discovered that many of those artists who now are world famous, whether it's Sai Guochang or Xu Bing or any of them from that generation, they always said to me, oh, if you want to really understand my work, you have to go back to the Cultural Revolution when we were growing up. They were our formative years. And so we together did this exhibition, and it was designed to be during the year of the Beijing Olympics, at which there was a heightened awareness of China, but also Chinese art and culture and history. And there were many tribulations as to the Chinese government not wanting us to do the exhibition for various reasons. But we ended up doing it. And I'm very proud of that accomplishment, because it was the first exhibition and helped much better understanding of that formative moment that still continues to have an impact in China. That generation are all in important positions of power. And so they're defining, in a way, the 21st century, even today.
Amazing. So when you were talking about, there's a lot of reasons for lack of diversity, right? There's history, there's ignorance, there's also assumptions and cultural prejudice. Do you find that you've had to directly overcome that and address it or expose it? How do you manage that?
So the issue of diversity is one that is really front of people's minds today. It was through my own experiences in Sydney also something that defined my own professional practice. When I was coming of age looking for jobs in Sydney, I did notice that there were no Asian Australians in leadership positions, no Asian Australians even in curatorial positions, not even in departments of Asian art.
Wow.
And so that really struck me, and that prompted the establishment of what we know as 4A, the Asia Australia Art Centre. And the idea behind that was to give opportunities to Asian Australian artists to be in conversation with Australian and Asian artists, but also to train the next generation of Asian Australian curators and museum directors. And so even from decades ago, and my own experience, we were very focused on how we could be more inclusive, knowing that larger institutions sometimes take a little longer to be responsive to what were very broad changes to Australian society. So I'm very happy that Foray continues, and it has actually helped a whole generation of curators and museum directors take their place into positions where they can now be a part of the conversation, where when I was graduating from university, that was certainly not the case.
Is it also about challenging conventional understandings of what art is when you bring diverse artists, female artists in? So like I host a television show that has a host of like authorities and commentators on it. And when we had to very like specifically change our makeup, so it was more diverse and we had more female voices, we had to challenge what was authority. What gives someone authority to speak about something? Do you have to have done a degree in it? Do you need to have worked in an area? And and what does lived experience mean? So in a way, you're kind of redefining why or how someone should be speaking in a public sphere. I know it's very different when it comes to art, but in a way, have you had to challenge some of the traditional assumptions about what's important art?
I think one of the really interesting projects going on right now in museums, in some ways, is the rewriting of history to be more inclusive of different voices. And so in a way, that's arguing for being a part of the conversation, having a seat at the table. And so that's in a way the tangible work that I see as still being needed and still being carried out. And it was certainly one of the interests that I had in exhibitions such as the Namjoon Paik exhibition at the Asia Society, or even the Yayoi Kusama exhibition that was at the Hirshhorn. These were voices, in a way, in the New York art world that, for various reasons, were not part of the kind of retelling of 20th century history. So, and there were all sorts of reasons why. They were both Asian, but there were other reasons also, and why they weren't included, and that was primarily because they didn't fit into the movement, the various different art movements. They didn't fit neatly into a category, and I think that's what we talk about in terms of exclusionary practices. We need to be much more open about what it means to be an artist, to create compelling work. And I think that this is a real moment within the art world today that is much more inclusive, not just of women artists and non-binary artists, but also artists from different cultural backgrounds. So we do see right now a great sense of openness, much more so than ever before. And so in that sense, it's an incredibly exciting moment.
How have you gone about the process of encouraging and championing female artists?
So in some ways, this is a process that is just really about the doing. And I say that because, it really is about always looking at, and from the difference between, I think, for museum folks in being a museum director as opposed to a curator, is that the museum director is looking at the program, the slate of exhibitions in a holistic way. Right? So we're looking at, okay, how do we tell a story, a narrative, or even take the pulse of this moment through a successive number of exhibitions? And so for me, that's what I've been most interested in. It's, okay, how can we be as inclusive as possible in terms of women artists, but others? I mean, I curated the exhibition of Shirin Neshat's work. It was the first exhibition within the first year of me joining the Hirshhorn. And it was an important exhibition, not just because she's Iranian American, but also because she was a woman. She's a woman, and there were very few exhibitions given over to the scale of her exhibition that had happened previously at the museum. So that was an important thing for us. Each museum and each institution has its own, in a way, blind spots. And so it was a process of looking at that and trying to do the work. It's not easy to do something you haven't done before. So it does sometimes require not just patience, but also kind of, you know, having, in some ways, you know, we talk about this, in a way, it's kind of influence management. It's bringing people along with change takes time.
Right, but you've you've had such great success with that. Can you reflect a little on that, like on what you've learned from the public's reaction and enthusiasm for some of the exhibitions that you've curated?
So if I think back to our kind of groundbreaking year when we reflected on it, received, you know, 1.2 million visitors, and in that year we presented Yayoi Kusama and Ai Weiwei. As chance happens, they're both Asian artists, which was great, but they were also artists that I had a strong belief in both of what they had to say. Very different messages, very different ways of working. But both artists, I think, really had something important to say at that moment in time. And so...
What was that?
Well, I think for Ai Weiwei, we showed portraits of prisoners of political conscience.
Mm-hmm.
And that was at a moment when there was so much debate about freedom of speech. And Ai Weiwei is an artist who I had met many years ago in China, and so we had a relationship already. I showed his photographs of the time that he spent in New York in the 80s, and that exhibition happened right when he was imprisoned in China. And so we had a whole relationship over the years that was based on my study in China and research. But when it came to what was important in Washington at that moment, in the nation's capital on the National Mall, it was about issues around freedom of speech. And so that was a really important and very topical exhibition. And then for Yayoi Kusama, so interesting that, you know, she had to really wait until she was in her 80s to get recognition. And I often say for women,
I love that.
You have to survive. You just have to survive until you're, you know, an octogenarian, and then you'll, you know, the world is your oyster. So
that's so great.
You know, she was gaining attention for her work already, but it was the decision to focus on her infinity mirrored rooms that I think kind of really had a huge impact. And it was the infinity mirrored rooms that I'd always wanted to do a show of them when I was at Asia-Pacific, and we never quite got to it. And so she was one of the first artists I visited when I went to the Hirshhorn, and we talked about this infinity mirrored room focus, because before, we have to understand that even though there's such a sensation now that social media has helped, there was a time when they were always thought of as the sideline to her practice and not really significant, that it was really her infinity net paintings that everyone loved and thought were her most important contribution to art history.
Tell us why they're so important.
Because the infinity mirrored rooms are what I think are an encapsulation of what art can be today. So when she did the first one in 1965 in New York, called Falley's Field, it was part sculpture, part installation, part performance. She was immersed in it. And I think for that reason, it was always thought of as kind of, you know, what is that work? I guess it's an installation, but then she's in it. She records herself in it. You know, it kind of, a little bit like Nam June Paik's work as well, they defied categorization, and so it didn't sit neatly. And so everybody really thought the Infinity Net paintings, gorgeous as they are, but they are the art historical record. And so when we did the Hirshhorn exhibition and then sent it around North America on tour, it was also right at a moment when visitors began to really engage in social media. And so that kind of confluence of a fully immersive artwork that also reflects the viewer is a part of the artwork because of the mirrors, that aligned with social media made it a kind of, you know, a social media phenomenon. We had 93 million engagements with work. So, you know, and so you wouldn't have had that, you know, 10, 15 years ago, it just wouldn't have been possible. So it is, you know, and these artists were speaking to their time, which is something that we talk a lot about at the Hirshhorn. Our mission is to reflect the art of our time. And so it is about finding the artworks or artists who we think are saying something significant about the moment that we're living in.
How do you do that? I mean, is that like, I know your instincts come into play here, but capturing a zeitgeist, like so many people who attempt to do that are inevitably just behind it. You know, it's kind of like when, you know, parents find out about TikTok and the teenagers have been onto it for like 10 years. How do you do that?
So the interesting thing about museum work is that we plan years in advance.
Right.
So we plan exhibitions 3, sometimes 5 years in advance. So in some ways we're forecasting, especially for modern contemporary art, right? We're always thinking, okay, what artist is doing compelling, interesting work that we think will be even more interesting? So you're right in that a degree of the work is intuitive, but it's also looking at what we think, you know, basically it's about trying to be a little bit ahead of the curve rather than on the curve, because you can't do that in museum work. And so it is trying to be a little bit ahead. You know, the time that I spent in New York really taught me that. You know, we were a mid-sized institution within a very large competitive ecology. And so, you know, I used to say to a senior team, like, what can we do that nobody else can do? That nobody else can do. And so that often meant that we did really difficult exhibitions, like really tough exhibitions that a lot of people might not even touch because they were so hard.
Like what?
Well, so for example, and they were often at the Asia Society, interestingly enough, the contemporary art exhibitions were kind of easier to organize. It was the traditional art exhibitions that were really hard. And that's what I kind of, you know, I started to really get into the complexity and difficulty required to do them. So I mean, it's straight. We all, you know, how do we make our lives harder?
Yeah.
You know, I really enjoyed saying, okay, what is the impossible show? You know, and it ranged from reuniting traditional artworks that had been separated by war or, you know, various reasons. I mean, one of the most notable is probably the exhibition that I did with Pakistan, which was a huge feat of cultural diplomacy. So I learned that because I was working on an exhibition of contemporary art from Pakistan while I was there, I saw the work of this Gandhara period, 3rd century material, which was just incredibly beautiful, aesthetic, but also told this story of Pakistan being a very different place in ancient time, a center of Buddhist learning and education and peace. And it was also showed the bridge between the East and the West. So these were sculptures in stone, gorgeously carved, but somehow somewhat Eastern and Indian in their influence, but also Western and Greco-Roman. And so there were these extraordinary treasures in Lahore and Karachi from museums there that I thought they'd never left the country when I started to talk to the museums. And so to try to get permission for those objects to leave the country to tell a very different story of Pakistan's history to Americans that were only used to really seeing Pakistan through the media lens of terrorism in a post 9/11 war. Mm-hmm. And so right when we were about to have the exhibition, Osama bin Laden was assassinated, and there were lots of infighting between state powers and federal powers. And even though the gallery sat empty for some months, I persisted with the negotiations, and we finally got those works to the US right at a moment when US and Pakistan were in an all-time diplomatic low. And we had help from everyone in Pakistan at the highest political levels, at the UN, in New York, and we made it happen. And that was such an extraordinary kind of cultural moment.
Right.
For Americans and also the Pakistanis who had helped. So I still look back and think that was something that will probably never happen again. And really, I mean, it was so hard. I mean,
Speaking of very complex challenges you like to set yourself.
No, we have to continue to, grow in these jobs. So partly it was about, and also having a bigger goal, this idea of how can art or an art exhibition help people to see the world differently, help change people's minds. These are the kind of bigger goals of museum work that
So how do you think about that now with reference to diplomatic tensions and Chinese art, for example? There's a lot of anxiety and trepidation and chest beating and misunderstandings about China at the moment, concerns about human rights abuses, but also often very two-dimensional characterizations of what it is, what the history and culture of China. So how do you view that tension?
So right now, it feels somewhat for the first time as if we're truly in the 21st century. And in a way, COVID may well have been that marker, in the same way that World War I and II were the markers of the 20th century.
Yeah.
We are now in a fully digital world. We can do things like this. We're interconnected, and it just looks and feels very different. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be a mistake for us to think that things will just simply continue as they did in the 20th century. And part of that conversation is about understanding that things are changing geopolitically as well. And a lot of my work within art has been with China, in fact, whether it was doing my PhD on the Chinese contemporary art scene that emerged only in the 1980s, whether it was taking a group of American museum directors to China to meet with their colleagues in a series of convenings, conversations, and publications. And what was distinct about then was that there was a desire for conversation. There was a desire to learn. There was a desire for conversation. And I think there is right now a real caution on both of our sides. That is the inside and outside of China. There's a real caution because of us feeling like the status quo is not the status quo anymore. And so the hope is that all of that cultural dialogue that happened before, all of our connections with one another, the hope is that that is not lost, because COVID, I think, has been a real rupture in the communications between those inside and outside China. And so I think, with all of the work that's been done over the years, the hope is that it leads to more collaboration and more understanding. I think one of the things that was very apparent before was that many people in China feel like this is the moment for China. That this is a moment of great pride, as opposed to their feelings for the last 100 years or so longer. So I think it is only by understanding their point of view that we'll really come at greater collaboration and understanding. I think it's a difficult moment, though, for diplomatic relations all around.
Very. Is this something that you're hoping to do through art?
I think art, I think that art can always play a role in creating more understanding between different people and different cultures. So that would always be a hope. I think that, I've done so much work with Chinese artists over the decades. And so I think, the idea is that we want to do more, we want to see more. And hopefully we can build a better understanding that goes both ways, not just one way.
Because you probably also would be very conscious of some of the potential impacts for dissident artists, right?
Yes, I've worked a lot with artists who were in the 1980s and 1990s considered dissidents. And the interesting part about that was that they kind of became then incorporated into, universities, art schools, galleries, museums. There was less of a us and them approach over the last few years. So now, however, I think it's becoming stricter. So we'll see. It's hard to know because the communication between China and the outside world has not been the same with COVID. Everyone has been locked down, and so communication has also been locked down.
So art is very much about ideas, and I think a lot of people listening to you right now will be fascinated by your intuition about which ideas will be important in 2, 5, 10 years' time. Can you tell us with some of the ideas you're grappling with now?
So your question's an interesting one because in some ways it's the idea itself that has become important.
Right. Okay.
More so than the medium or the materials.
Yeah, wow.
I often think of an artist like Marcel Duchamp. And it was 100 years ago that he had a little glass flask that he closed up and said that there was air inside. And that was the artwork. Or another work known as a ready-made called The Fountain, which was really a urinal. Those acts were so radical in their time that their impact is still being felt, but he's probably one of the most influential artists for this moment because he said that art is what I say it is. It is the idea. It is not the fact that somebody else made this work and I went to the supermarket and bought it. Right? That's not important that I didn't make it. It's important that I say that it's art, and it is the idea is central. And I think at this moment in time, that is at the crux of our understanding of not just where artists are today, but also, I would hesitate to say, even society. In the 21st century, it is the idea more than the tangible thing.
So fascinating. Would it also be mirrored in technology? being in the 21st century?
Yes. So one of the interesting things I think about this moment in time is that we feel like there is a real dawn of a new century for probably the first time. You know, an example I often think of in trying to really capture this moment is that where once we would have stored our paper files in a filing cabinet in our office with a lock and key. Now, when we work, we store our files in the cloud. We don't know where the cloud is, who really owns it, and really how to get our stuff back if ever we need it. So in some ways that demonstrates this kind of shift in a way from the physical to the digital, or the tangible to the intangible. And I think when we are looking at what it means to make art in this moment, it's not just about new technology, it's actually about how the idea comes about. In a way, it's more than the material that the artist uses to make the artwork in. And so these are kind of the big issues that we grapple with in contemporary art world today.
Do you think that's going to become more the case? Like, where do we go from here with that concept?
So I always remember growing up, there was a big debate about video killing film.
Yes.
Right? It was like, oh, nobody's ever going to want to go to the cinema again.
Yeah.
You can stay at home and watch a video. I think for museums, we know that the in real life experience, that encounter with an art object, becomes perhaps even more important as our lives become increasingly digital. So I think that's in a way the interest for museums and art. Art is that physical encounter, that physical real life experience. Now, it's true to say that more and more of what we do in the contemporary art world does involve technology. It might involve video art. It may even involve NFTs. But we do know that art is as relevant today as it ever was before. I always remind people that actually it's art that survives. Art survives, you know, if we think of the great ancient civilizations, it's really the art and architecture that survives, that tells us about that society. And so when we think about that, it's an extraordinary moment to be in this kind of museum world, in the contemporary art world, because we are seeing artists create work that is not just responsive to our time, but also sometimes even predictive.
Okay, that idea of art, an artist as futuristic is something that we don't really think about, actually. But just unfortunately, we're almost out of time. I could talk to you all day. But can you just say, in honour of Betty Churchill and this oration, like, what do you have to say about the place that women artists have in the art world, and how we're changing our thinking around that?
So firstly, I'd say that Betty Churchill was an extraordinary woman. She led the National Gallery at a moment where there were no other women in leadership positions of her type. So to be the first requires a lot. So I wanted to recognize that and her importance to the field. In terms of recognizing women artists in our work, I think for us it's about creating both an historical appreciation, meaning for us to go back and to rewrite the art history that was exclusionary. That's one part of the project. The other part of the project is the present, the work that we need to do to recognize not just the voices of women, but also others that have different points of view. We are at an extraordinary kind of open, transparent moment. So how can we be a part of that? That's what I'm most interested in.
Oh, you're amazing, Dr. Chiu. Thank you so much for talking to us today. We so appreciate it. All right, and Dr. Melissa Chiu there has left us with that fundamental question of how can we be part of it? How can we be part of supporting, encouraging, understanding, listening to the provocation of a diverse range of artists and the work they produce, and what we hope will be a creative kind of blooming that's come out of the COVID era. I think it's astonishing to think about art being an idea. It's astonishing to think about art predicting a future. And I guess the question for so many of us is whether or not we're listening well enough. And on that note, I just want to thank you for your time today. And thank you so much, Dr. Chiu.
Julia, thank you.
Thank you.